Okay, so this morning's class is sponsored by Sally Haber and Gary Mizrahi, Leidoi Nishmat Shafia Batzakia, their mother-in-law, Sophie Kassan who passed away in the last month. So what we're talking about today is a continuation of the concept of mavoi, the concept of carrying. And in order to understand the concept of carrying, we need to understand the concept of a mavoi. A mavoi is a particular type of area that has some different laws about carrying and so on and so forth. Ezra, I know you're driving, so you're not going to be able to see all the different things that I'm going to show on the screen, but I'm going to do my best, and there's going to be a recording here. Hold on, let me go back to this. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just show my screen. Hold on, get that. Oh, great, I have a bunch of different things that I could show. So the first thing I'm going to show is kind of what's called a mavoi. A mavoi is an alleyway. If you could look at this picture, you'll notice that kind of you're looking from the street into an alleyway in which several buildings create that alleyway and empty out into that alleyway. That's called a mavoi. It was a standard way of living in the time of the Talmud, and there were a couple different types of mavoi. This is kind of what you would call a dead end alleyway. There's another type of alleyway which is kind of more common to what we have today, which is a mavoi that's what they call mifulash. Mifulash means that it opens on either end, meaning the street runs from, in this picture, I guess you would say, from north to south, from one end to the other. And what you'll notice here, this picture is a little bit better. What you'll notice is the way that they lived was that there were multiple little buildings. Those buildings opened up into courtyards, what we would call, front yard or something like that. But there were lots of walls. And again, all this was done for security and protection. The way that we live is a lot more open because we're a lot less concerned about marauders and things like that. And our homes are a lot better sealed and security and so on and so forth. But in the olden days, the way that they lived for protection was to have lots of sets up of walls and twists and turns. And anyone who's been in an old city, the old city of Jerusalem is one example, but there are many, many other examples in Europe of old cities that have this kind of setup, which was set up for a few different reasons, but one of them is for safety and security. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. This is the way that they lived. You see the mavoi, it's kind of labeled right down the center of the picture, which kind of has two chatzers. A chatzer is a courtyard offshooting it. So that was something that we started to describe on Friday, but I wanted to have a picture for you. Now, basically, we're going to talk about what are the rules about carrying from one of those homes to the chatzer, from a chatzer to the mavoi. And then, of course, the mavoi, as you can see on the bottom of the picture here, if you look closely, shoots off into Reshut Harabim. Reshut Harabim means the public space. Not sure if you could see my going back and forth here, but that's the public space. So you have various different kind of gradations of what kind of spaces we have. If you remember, we talked about in the beginning, Reshut Harabim, Reshut Yachid, Carmelit. So the question is, so what do these get considered? This chatzer, this mavoi, are we allowed to carry there or not? So actually, oh, by the way, this mavoi, I'm just noticing now, actually has a back wall there. Okay, I thought that was open, but okay. But regardless, the basic idea that we have here is that you have this kind of closed off alleyway. Is that considered Reshut Harabim, Reshut Yachid? That's going to be one of the big questions that we have in terms of understanding this. So would this, so in order to consider this a mavoi and not a Reshut Harabim, meaning not a wide open space, it needs to have the three walls. And if you can see, you have one on the left, one on the top, one on the right. It needs the fourth wall, but then if it was a fourth wall, it would be completely enclosed, right? So it doesn't need a full wall, but what it needs is what they call Tzurat HaPetach. You see it right on the bottom of the picture. Tzurat HaPetach means the vision, the form of a doorway. There needs to be some doorway. And actually, within this picture, you can see the doorway. The two olives on either side create kind of like you need a pole that holds it up, and then you need a top piece that's called a lechi. So you need a korea on each side. A korea is like a pole on each side, and you need a beam on the top. So when you have that, the two olives and the bet on the top, then you have a fourth side, even though it's open, right? That's called Tzurat HaPetach. Even though there's very little that is, considered a side there, it's really a complete doorway, but nevertheless, that kind of encloses in the mavoy. So I just want to make sure everyone's with me on that. Everyone see what I'm saying there? David, is the picture clear?
Yes, I can see it.
Great.
Yep.
Okay, good. Ezra, I know you're driving, so you're not going to be able to see that.
Right.
But okay, so that's one type of Tzurat HaPetach. Now, one of the things that I'll point out to you is that, in picture A, right, that we just looked at. Sorry, let me go back to it 1 second. In this picture, right, so the aleph and the bet are connected, right, meaning the poles and the beam on top. The beam sits on top of the poles and physically is connected. The reality is it doesn't even need to physically connect. If you see this picture, David, did the picture change for you?
Yeah, I see it. Yeah.
Right. So if you notice, A is not connected to B, right? B is well above A, but that's okay, right? That's okay also. The B doesn't have to necessarily connect to A. As long as it goes over A, we'll consider it as if it's connected, even if there's a very big vacant space there. Okay, so that's part one that's important to know.
Yeah.
And part two
Right.
that's important to know is sometimes we do it like this, where the A's, the olives, are two beams, but the top, rather than being a third beam, is actually some kind of string, right? And now probably we're in the realm of talking about Erub, right? That most people are used to see the poles and the strings. So the poles and the strings are basically creating this, right? They're basically creating the doorway to the other area, right? So that's the basic idea behind the poles and the strings. And I think that's the end of me needing to show you pictures on it. So that's the basic idea of what's happening with the poles and the strings, and basically what we're trying to do is create an enclosed area. And when we have an enclosed area, we might look at it differently than when it's an open area. Because if it's an open area, right, we'll call it Reshut Harabim. We'll call it the public, thoroughfare. It's a place where it belongs to everyone, where everyone could go. But if we can enclose it somehow, ideally with three sides of walls, and then that one side with the doorway, so now it's in a different category of an area. It's called a mavoy or a chatzer, and then it belongs only to a few people, not to everyone. And then the way that we'll deal with it is going to be different. Okay, so that's the basic idea of what we have. So like, in a let's say, I'm going to look at a kind of a standard Brooklyn house, right? So Brooklyn house, there's a lot of them, one next to the other, right? But then there's a driveway, in between, right? So let's say someone wants to carry from one house to the next house, right? Is he able to? So one of the things that we're going to try and do is to enclose in that driveway, right? The driveway is enclosed on two sides by the houses on each side, and often in the back by the fence in the backyard, right? So three sides are enclosed in. So what do we need to do? We need to take two poles and then a beam on top, and that closes in the driveway, and then that kind of makes the driveway what we just drew, this mavoy, right? So you don't have to think too hard to find mavoys in our areas. A mavoy fits very well. Also, what we might say also is when I'm going to pull this back 1 second. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to share my screen again. And it's not so hard to imagine that our front porches, right? If you have, let's say you live in a 2-family or a 3-family house, and there's a front porch, right? So the front porch is like the chatzer, right? It's an area that is enclosed. Usually there's a fence around the porch, right? But it's an area that's shared between multiple people, right? There's this house and that house, right? So that's very similar to a front porch. So we actually have a lot of examples of this in our way that we live, right? The very easy to see chatzer, right? Like the front porch where it's a 2-family or 3-family, or, where they all open up into one area, or the mavoi, which is the kind of like the driveway, or a dead-end street. I think, what's the name of that street? There's one right off of Coney Island Avenue between RNS, I don't know if it's First Court or something like that, but basically it's a dead end, right? And it's pretty much enclosed in by houses. So basically you could do the same type of thing. So you have these kinds of setups around, but most streets and most places that we're familiar with don't fit into this category, right? Most streets and most places that we're familiar with in the cities that we live in are generally, they're generally pretty open, right? And even most properties are generally pretty open. And what you see people do is they, rather than have 3 walls and then put a doorway, what do they do? The strings and the poles, what do? They put the strings and the poles all the way around, right? So you have 4 sides, which are strings and poles, right? Or 3, but a lot of sides where they're using strings and poles. And there's a question as to whether or not that's acceptable, but it's pretty much become acceptable today that people will do this, and whether they'll do it on their own property, right, which you'll see very commonly, right, where you have someone set up on his own property, strings and poles all the way around, or whether they'll do this on a city, right? And where do they do this in a city? So what they do is they find a way to use the telephone poles and allow the telephone poles to become the doorways, right? And the telephone poles, they work, right? There's some tricks that you have to do in order to make a telephone pole fit exactly into the details of the Gemara, but they do it, right? And therefore, in many cities, many cities around the world, including in Deal, New Jersey, one of the primary tools, and in Brooklyn, New York, one of the primary tools that they use is they use the telephone wires as what we're calling the tzurat hapetach, the doorway that encloses a particular area, and that's going to be really, really important to understanding how an Erub works, which is the next step that we're going to do. Okay, so basically what we've said is that although we have the 4 basic areas, Reshut Rabim, Reshut Yachid, Carmelit, and Makom Petur, what happens in practicality is we have these kind of middle ground spaces, and whether or not we'll consider them Reshut Yachid or a Carmelit or Reshut Rabim is going to depend on whether or not we can enclose these places. Now, one of the things that I'm not going to really get into is that many of the Chachamim say that in order to create this for a city, you need actual doors, not just a doorway, and that at some point they need to physically close. And some Eruvs actually set this up. When they were building the Brooklyn Eruv a number of years ago, you may not have noticed it, but because they hit it very, very well, but they created a situation in which there were, quote, doors on Ocean Parkway in order to close off Ocean Parkway. And I remember on a tour that I took of the Eruv many, many years ago with Chacham Shaul Alav Shalom. So Rabbi Shaul Kassin, so he actually showed us that they had hidden, you couldn't believe that it was there, but it was there in plain sight. They had these gates that were very long, but they rolled up, and they extended across Ocean Parkway, and they closed on Ocean Parkway. They were arranged with the city to be able to close it at 2 in the morning on some dead night for some short period of time, but they actually were there. So you'll see that they'll do that on some of these city eruvs, where they'll actually find a place to find and make strategically some clear doors, gates to close things off. So that's in the ideal sense, but in the practical sense, most of the time, That's not what happens. Most of the time, they're going to be relying on the poles and the strings. And again, as we mentioned, that in cities, very often what they're going to use for poles and strings, and I'm simplifying it, so it's not so simple, but they'll use the telephone wires to be able to create the poles and strings. Okay, so now that we said all that, right, which is all a precursor to the next part, right, which is, so bottom line, are these areas places that I'm allowed to carry in or not, right? If I enclose it with a string, does that mean I could carry there? If I enclose it in the mavoy, in the picture that I showed you before, if I have a shared courtyard, if I have a shared front porch with my neighbor? So the answer is still not. The Chachamim made a decree. And they say this is Takanat Bet Shlomo Ubet Inos. This maybe goes all the way back to Shlomo HaMelech. And what they say is, look, they didn't want people to not have a sense of the laws of carrying. So they made a rule, unless it was a private place, right, meaning owned by one person, then you had to create what's called an Erub or a Shituf. And I'm going to explain the difference between the two in a second. An Erub means that we got together, right? So let's go back to the picture of the Chatzer, right? So you have a Chatzer here, right? And either on the left or on the right, you have two homes that share the courtyard, right? So what was the rule, right? That courtyard is considered Reshut HaYachid, right? It's not a place for the public, so it's considered Reshut HaYachid. So what the Chachamim said was, even though it's a Reshut HaYachid, since it's shared by multiple people, if we allow people to carry there, they'll carry anywhere, right? And we need to do something to signify that they can't carry everywhere, right? And that they can only carry here. So what did they do? They created what's called the mitzvah of Erub. Erub means we get together. And how do we get together? We get together and we create a shared meal. A meal which I can take from and you can take from, or let's say person A or person B can take from in the Chatzer. And by saying this shared meal is set aside, now everyone knows, it signifies we can only carry in this Chatzer, but not that we could carry elsewhere, not that we could carry outside the Chatzer, because the shared meal signifies that just as we share this meal, we share the Chatzer, and the Chatzer is very obvious to us to be Reshut HaYachid. So that's why they created the concept of Eruv. Eruv allowed you to carry just in the Chatzer. Now, as you can imagine, once you wanted to be able to carry in the Chatzer, so they wanted to say, well, our neighbors are across the street in the other Chatzer. Can we carry in the Mavoy from Chatzer to Mavoy to Chatzer? So they answered, if the Mavoy is enclosed, based on the laws that we already explained, then you can create what's called a Shituf. Shituf is join. It's another word for Eruv. But it just is an Eruv that covers more space and more area. It's more of a public, pardon that term, more of a public Eruv. And therefore, the same basic concept applied, was that you would set aside a meal for all the people in the Mavoy. So now instead of the two houses in the Chatzer, you set aside a meal that all four people who live in the Mavoy are able to share in. You set it aside, and if you set it aside, then you're able to signify that we're only allowed to carry in the Mavoy, not beyond the Mavoy, right? So that's how you create an Eruv or a Shituf, right? As you set aside a shared meal, and then when you set aside that shared meal, everyone knows that's in that area, I can only carry in that area. If it's in a small area, right, like the Chatzer, it's called an Eruv. If it's in a larger area, like a Mavoy, it's called a Shituf. That's the basic way that the Eruv gets set up. And as you can see, if I could set it up for a Chatzer, I could set up for a Mavoy, if I am going to be lenient enough and I could create the walls around a wide enough space, I could make it around a city, right? And that's basically what's done, right? They make it around a city. They basically say they set aside some food, and usually what's done in an Eruv is you take it. If I'm doing it on my front porch, I could set aside some bread, right? And I tell my neighbor, hey, I'm setting aside this bread. It's so that you and I could both carry on the shared porch that we have, right? In a city, what do? We set aside, by the way, and you don't have to set aside bread, you could set aside other shared food, but bread is the normal food that we use. And actually, because we don't want to have it only for one Shabbat, what we'll usually do is set aside matzah, which lasts much longer. And you could set aside a box of matzah once every year. And in fact, that's what people do in the cities. They set it, the people who run the Erub in a city set aside a box of matzah. They set aside a box of matzah once a year, and they kind of renew it, and that's how they do it. Every year they make the mitzvah, they renew the Erub, so to speak. Now, what's interesting is, in the small, you need to get everyone who's there's permission, right? So in a chatzer, on my front porch, in my driveway, it's easy. I talk to my neighbor. I say, hey, I'm setting up an eruv, no problem. But in a city, right, or even a big street, it's not so simple because you got to get everyone's permission. So what do you have to do? For the more what we'll call municipal eruv, right? The eruv in a city, rather than go to each individual person, especially if there's non-Jews and things like that who won't even understand, or Jews that won't understand. So what they do is they go to the municipality. They speak to the mayor. They speak to someone that has kind of control over the city, and that person kind of grants permission for everybody else, and that's how they allow them to do it. One other thing that we'll say is when we make the eruv, right, what do? We actually take the bread, we give it to, if it's a person that, if I'm sharing two people in eruv, I make the eruv, I go to the other person, I say, here, take the matzah, lift it up, and he does. In the city, it's a little bit more complicated, but we'll take it to someone to be able to do that way. And when we make the eruv, we make a beracha. The person making the eruv says, Asher k'deshan mitzvotav v'tzivanu al mitzvat eruv. Right? And then as he says that, he says it in Aramaic, but basically I'm translating. He says, with this eruv, or with this shituf, it will be allowed for us to take in, to take out, to carry from the house to the courtyard, from the courtyard to the house, from the house to the pit, from the pit to the house, from the roof to roof, from one attic to another attic, from this corner to that corner, from this street to that street, and so on and so forth. You say all these different places where you can be able to carry, and you list them, and that kind of allows you to make the eruv, and allows that makes the eruv, and that allows people to carry within the enclosed area for the time frame established, usually for a year. Although it's noted here in the book that we normally read from, that the Ari Zal, the very famous Ari, the Kabbalist from Tzfat, would actually make the eruv once every Shabbat. Would make it once every Shabbat. Now, one of the questions that's a big question is, let's say I live in an apartment building where everybody owns their own apartment, but it's inside, right? So there's a real question as to whether or not you need an eruv even within the building, right? And many rabbis say that you do need an eruv even within the building, because the hallways are kind of like the mavoi here. Not everyone agrees. Not everyone says that you have to. Whether or not it's a hotel, a hotel is the same type of scenario, but one can do that. So when would this come into play? Well, obviously if you live in an apartment building, but also someone who goes and stays in a hotel for Shabbat or something like that might do what's called an eruv, to allow, to set aside some matzah, to allow him to carry within the hotel or within the hotel grounds, probably an appropriate thing to do there as well. I'm going to stop here because that's kind of the end of this topic. And tomorrow we'll talk about the idea of what do I do if there's no eruv in a particular place? Are there any things that I can carry in interesting ways? We're going to talk about some things like my glasses or my keys or things like that, which are going to be necessary, some of the things that we do. So that's what we're going to stop for today. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I'm just going to stop and we'll pick up with Minyan in 2 minutes.
Have
Have a great day.
Very
Okay.
good.
Okay.